On June 22, 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, a surprise attack on the Soviet Union after years of deceiving Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin into a false sense of security. While consolidating its dominance over Western Europe, Germany was ready to confront the massive Soviet Red Army. More than 3.5 million German and Axis troops launched an offensive along a 1,800-mile front. A total of 148 divisions, representing 80% of the German army, were dedicated to the campaign. 17 Panzer divisions, organized into 4 Panzer groups and equipped with 3,400 tanks, led the charge. They were backed by 2,700 Luftwaffe aircraft, making it the largest invasion force in history at that time. The Germans made strong gains early, with the Panzer groups advancing rapidly towards their objectives, as the Russian forces collapsed in disarray. The vast numbers of Soviet troops and equipment thrown against the German army were quickly lost, and the Germans had little trouble decimating the Soviet tank forces that were sent their way. With their proven combined arms tactics, honed and tested over the years, Germany made significant gains, crushing vast numbers of Soviet tanks as they advanced. However, the tide was about to turn as the Soviets began to unleash their secret super tanks in large numbers, the T-34 and KV-1. When German gunners confronted these steel giants, they quickly realized their weapons were no match for the T-34's thick, sloped armor. Despite firing over 30 anti-tank rounds, the T-34 returned to its lines almost unscathed. An excerpt from a German battle report emphasized the near invincibility of the T-34 in the eyes of German soldiers at the time. Half a dozen anti-tank guns fire shells at him, which sound like a drum roll, but he drives staunchly through our line like an impregnable prehistoric monster. It is remarkable that Lieutenant ST's tank made hits on one of the T-34s once at about 20 meters and 4 times at 50 meters with Panzer Granit 40 ammunition without any noticeable effect. To understand why the Germans were both surprised and shocked when they encountered the latest Soviet tanks, it's essential to first examine the state of each nation's armored forces in 1941. When the fighting began, the majority of Soviet armor consisted of T-28 light tanks and the BT series, including the BT-5 and BT-7. Additionally, the Soviets had smaller numbers of the more formidable T-34 and KV-1 tanks within their ranks. At this point, Germany was phasing out production of the Panzer II, with the latest variant being the Panzer IIF. Most of the tanks in service were still the earlier Panzer IIc model. Production of the Panzer III was on the rise, with the F, G and H models making up the majority of the fleet. Among these, only the relatively small number of Panzer IIIH tanks were equipped with the KWK 38 50mm L42 cannon. Panzer IIIH tanks were equipped with the KWK 38 50mm L42 cannon, while the rest of the Panzer III continued to use the shorter 37mm gun. The Panzer IV was still primarily used in its infantry support role, equipped with a short-barreled 75mm gun, with the E model being the most recent version at the time. Additionally, Panzer 38T tanks were also in service. But here's the situation. All of these German tanks could easily penetrate the armor of a BT-5 or T-26. At the same time, the Russian 45mm guns were capable of piercing the armor of every German tank in service at typical combat ranges. The T-34, however, was a game-changer, with its sloped armor providing an effective thickness of 90mm and a powerful 76.2mm gun. The only German tank capable of penetrating its armor was the relatively rare Panzer IIIH. Even this tank's 50mm gun could only penetrate the T-34's armor at close range and flatter angles, specifically within 100 meters. No German tank stood a chance against that armor. On the other hand, both the 1940 and 1941 models of the T-34 could penetrate every German tank in service from distances of at least 500 meters. The T-34s were not only nearly impervious to fire from any German tank on the field, but they also had superior mobility. Despite using the same basic differential clutch and brake steering system as all German tanks of the time, the T-34's horsepower significantly surpassed that of any German tank. Although heavier than all of them, its wide tracks and low ground pressure allowed it to traverse soft ground where German tanks frequently got stuck, an essential advantage in the challenging terrain of the Eastern Front. The Germans, who had been facing opposition that was challenging but manageable, suddenly encountered a tank that was nearly impervious to their fire, could destroy anything they had from at least a 400-meter range, and outpaced all their vehicles. The only ways to effectively destroy T-34s were to either engage them with a rare tank and hope for a lucky shot, Call in air support or artillery fire, or lure them into landmines or an emplacement of 88mm flak guns, as no German anti-tank gun at the time could penetrate T-34 armor. As a result, the Germans strategically avoided direct tank battles with T-34s or KV-1s whenever possible. Initially, historians believed that these new tanks were scattered across the army in small numbers, but recent research reveals the opposite. These tanks were actually concentrated in specific formations, such as the Mechanized Corps. Among the Mechanized Corps, 4 formations were particularly well equipped. On the day of the German invasion, around 70% of all T-34 and KV tanks produced at the time were concentrated in the 4th, 6th, 8th, and 15th Mechanized Corps. The 6th Mechanized Corps operated in the Bialystok area, while the others were stationed in Soviet Ukraine. All of their encounters with German tanks occurred during or just before the Battle of Brody. At the start of Operation Barbarossa, tank-to-tank battles were rare because the Germans avoided engaging Soviet armor directly, opting instead to bypass it when possible. Efforts to destroy T-34 and KV tanks focused on immobilizing them by targeting their tracks, followed by using field artillery, anti-aircraft guns, or close-range attacks. Notably, the 4th and 6th Mechanized Corps lost nearly all of their T-34 and KV tanks during movements rather than from German attacks. Both corps attempted counterattacks against German infantry rather than panzers, but these efforts had minimal impact and went largely unnoticed. The 15th Mechanized Corps experienced a similar fate after June 26th. In the initial phases of the war, the Soviets tended to use their T-34 tanks in overly aggressive frontal assaults. This played into the strengths of the German anti-tank weapons and tactics, leading to high tank losses. Within the first 2 weeks of the invasion, the Soviet Union lost the majority of its T-34 and KV tanks, along with most of its older tanks. To the Germans' surprise, the Soviets were deploying increasing numbers of T-34s to compensate for their losses, far exceeding Germany's original projections. In 1942, Adolf Hitler made the following comment about the T-34s to his assembled army leaders at his Wolfslair headquarters. "If I had known that there were so many of them, I would have had second thoughts about invading." Despite the T-34's technical superiority, its effectiveness in early battles was severely hampered by improper implementation and poor crew training. Many drivers had less than 5 hours of experience behind the wheel, gunners had never operated a tank gun, and some crews had never even laid eyes on the T-34 before. This led to poor decision-making, improper maintenance, and an inability to fully leverage the tank's advantages. From a tactical standpoint, the T-34 was inferior to German tanks during Barbarossa, because it combined the roles of commander and gunner in a single crew member. Once the commander started firing, he lost his broader situational awareness and was unable to effectively direct the tank in battle. This limitation hampered their effectiveness in battle, and only a few exceptionally skilled Soviet commanders were able to overcome this disadvantage. This dual role made the T-34 largely inferior to German tanks like the Panzer III and IV, which had dedicated roles for both the commander and gunner. Russian tank attacks often saw T-34s charging forward like a herd of wild bulls, firing their guns continuously and without proper aiming. This approach may have been influenced by the limited training given to tank crews due to high losses, but the combination of commander and gunner roles in a single person was certainly a contributing factor. Soviet crews were punished for taking initiative, leading to rigid, predictable tactics that typically involved charging straight ahead in limited formations. German training, by contrast, emphasized tactical flexibility and gunnery skills, facilitated by the use of radios. German crews were encouraged to learn from their mistakes and experiment with different strategies. In contrast, Russian training was far more draconian. The Soviets often employed their tanks in uncoordinated, piecemeal attacks without proper infantry and anti-tank support. This left the T-34s vulnerable to being overwhelmed and outmaneuvered by the German combined arms approach. Until the introduction of the T-34-85 in 1944, only company commanders among T-34 units were equipped with radios. The shortage of radios in T-34s during Barbarossa meant that most Soviet crews relied on visual signals to communicate. However, battlefield smoke and dust rendered this communication ineffective. The inability to effectively coordinate tank movements with other T-34s and supporting units created additional problems for the Soviets.